Hi everyone, it's Shirley here. I'm back finishing up my quilt that's in behind me, and I'm going to be working on the binding today, so let's get started. I've done some calculations and I measured the outside of my quilt, and it measures 76 by 52. So I took the 76, which is one side. I need two sides, and I multiplied that by 2, and it came out to 152 inches. The top and bottom measure 52 inches. So I multiplied that by 2, and I came up with 104 inches. When I add those two together, it came out to 256 inches. So in order to find out how many strips I'm going to need, I need to divide that by the width of the fabric that I'm using. The width of the particular fabric that I'm using is 74 inches wide. When I divide that, I come up with a number of 3.4. So that is the number of strips I'm going to need. I now need to find out how much fabric I'm going to need. So I take that and I rounded it up to 4. So I have 4 strips, and I cut my binding at 2.5 inches. So 4 strips times 2.5 inches comes out to 10 inches of fabric. So from a 74 wide piece of fabric, I'm going to need 10 inches of that to get the binding I need for my quilt. The fabric I'm using to do my binding is a sheet that I found at a local Goodwill. It was a new sheet, never been used, and it was made from 100% organic cotton. When I washed it and measured it out, the piece I had was 74 by 94. So the width of the fabric is 74 inches. So I'm going to be cutting my width of fabric and my strips this way. The ruler I use to cut my binding strips at 2.5 inches is called the Shape Cut, and it's made by June Taylor. And what it is a ruler that is an acrylic ruler, and it has these slits in it, and each one corresponds to a number at the bottom, and then I can run my rotary cutter along. So to demonstrate that, I placed my ruler with the 0 marking along the folded edge of my fabric, and I've placed this 0 marking about 1/8 to 1/16 inch away from that cut edge that I have. If my fabric was wonky, then that way I get a straight cut on both sides. My first cut is going to be at the 0 mark. I'm using a weight to hold my ruler down, and I'm cutting at the 0 mark. So that is my first cut, and I'm going to take this, and that will be scrap. I now have everything lined up that I can do my cuts. My first cut is going to be at the 2.5, my second cut at the 5, the next cut at 7.5, and my last cut will be at the 10 inches. I can now remove my weight and remove my ruler, and I can now separate my strips. And at each top corner, because my fabric is wider than the ruler, I'll have to just cut a little tiny bit to complete the cuts. I now have my 4 strips that I need to do my binding. I've laid out my binding strips so that I have all my salvages lined up, and I'm going to be cutting those salvage edges off. I'm just going to take a ruler, line up one of the marks so I get a square cut, and I will trim off those salvage edges. I now have all my selvage edges cut off, or pretty much cut off. You can see where there's still a little bit there, but I'm going to be joining my strips using the bias join. I'm going to take one of my strips and I'm going to place it right side up on my cutting mat. I'm going to take my next strip and place it right sides together so it is forming an L shape. I want to join this with the bias seam. I have a little ruler that has the markings on it with the 45-degree angle. I want to place that 45-degree angle, and you can see point to point. I'm going to lay that on my bottom of that cut strip, and I'm going to make sure that it comes right to that point there, and this line is going to be lined up with the cut edge of the underneath fabric. And I'm just going to take a friction pen and mark my stitching line. So that's my first stitching line, and if I do a test and fold it along that line, you can see it's in the right direction. I'll just place that on there, and I'll do the same with each strip. I'm just going to put a pin in here just to hold it until I get all my strips done. I have my pieces lined up so I can do a chain piece and stitch all those down. So let's go to the sewing machine and get that started. I'm at the sewing machine now, and the foot that I'm going to be using is a stitch and ditch foot, which has a little metal piece coming down the center, and that is where I'm going to run my line so I get a nice straight seam. I'm going to be using a 2.0 stitch length, and I will back stitch at the beginning and the end of each seam. I've lined that line right up. I'm ready to stitch, so I'm going to start stitching with that center guide right along that stitching line, and I'm going to make sure that my point comes right at this little angle right here. I'm going to start stitching, and when I get into about 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to do a little 2 stitches back, and then I will come forward, making sure that my seam is lined up the way I want it, and just stitch down that stitching line. I'm coming to the end. I'm going to stop about 1/4 of an inch away, and I'm going to do a little back stitch. Only a couple of stitches is needed, and stitch so that that is coming right off. I'm going to take my next strip, remove my pin, and again line this up so that that point right there is right at that cut edge. I'm going to start stitching about 1/4 of an inch in. I'm going to do a couple of back stitches and then come forward. Now making sure that my bottom edge is lined up with that point right at the cut edge. I'm now at my cutting mat, and I am now going to trim away, lining that 1/4 inch mark along the seam line. Trim off my little dog ears. So I'm now going to just finger press them open. I'm going to be using the Acorn Precision Piecing Solution in my water brush, and I'm just going to run my water brush along there just to help keep those seams open and nice and flat. Take my little mini iron and just press. Now just going to press with my little mini iron, and I'm going to press all my binding just to make sure that it doesn't have any folds. So I'll just press the entire strip. I have the whole length of my binding strip pressed, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it so the cut edges match up. And here is my cut edge, and I'm just going to press it just down with my hands. I'm not going to be pressing this with the iron. So I'm just going to take a piece of template plastic and roll my binding strip up in that folded position onto that template plastic. As I'm rolling my binding strip onto my template plastic, every once in a while I will put a pin. My folded edge is right here, my cut edge is right here, and as I'm going along I'll just place a pin from the folded edge to the cut edge and just keep rolling it up. I'm coming to the end of my binding strip after folding it lightly and putting a few pins in. And I'm just, again, like I said, giving it a light finger press and putting a few pins in. Now, why did I not press this? But as we all know, when we fold our binding strips over, we're going to lose a little bit. And if I would have pressed that in, then when I folded it over, it's not going to fold exactly at that place. I just found it, if I don't press that seam down with the iron, or that strip down with the iron, I get a better binding. So here it is all rolled up. If you like, you can take that out, or you can just leave it on there. I'm just going to pull mine out, and now I'm ready to sew this onto my quilt, and I will be sewing this to the wrong side of my quilt, or the back side.